Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good whatever time it is, wherever you are. Welcome to pilot episode 5, can you believe it, of the Evening Moon podcast. The Evening Moon is still a working title. We're still looking for a name for this podcast. We've got some ideas, but if you, dear listener, have any decent names for what we should call this, then let us know. My name is Ben Cowles, and I'm joined by...
Do I say mine? Steve Sweeney. I didn't know whether to say my name or you were going to say it.
No,
I never know that bit, what to do.
I like to keep you on your toes.
Yeah.
Both Steve and I work at the Morning Star. I am the web editor for the Morning Star, and Steve is the...
International editor for the Morning Star.
This podcast is not the Morning Star's podcast, this is our own thing, but so all the views and opinions and blah, blah, blah that we express in this podcast are our own. So if you've got any problems with that, take it up with us, not with the employer. Cool. So today we've got a couple of stories today. We are going to talk about Leyla Guven, who is a Kurdish MP on hunger strike for how many days?
Today will be 92, I think.
Okay, now 92 days. And today we're recording on Wednesday, the 6th of February. Probably should have said that earlier.
Yeah.
But whatever. And she's been given an honorary citizenship of Paris. We're going to talk about that. We're going to finally put the interview with Marcel Cartier, who's an author and a hip-hop artist and I believe a friend of yours.
He is a friend of mine, yeah.
And we're going to be talking to him. We have an interview with him and we're talking about his book. We'll have more on that in a bit. But first, we're going to talk about kind of quite a sad story. Karl Marx's grave in Highgate Cemetery in London was damaged. It looks like someone took a hammer to it, smashed up the grave. They tried to cross out his name with a hammer, whoever did it. This is pretty shocking. Are you a fan of this kind of action, Steve?
Well, being a Marxist, obviously I'm not a fan of this kind of action. I think it's absolutely abhorrent that that this hammer attack has happened. But I think it kind of reflects things that are going on in society at the moment, particularly via this kind of the rise of people like Bolsonaro, Trump, and the right. I mean, I don't want to give them too much credence really, but I think it's sort of paved the way for this kind of open ground to do, and through the media, I have to say as well that they've played their role in this kind of the rise of this kind of attitude. And I don't know, someone who's obviously. It's a mindless act, really. I don't know, on the one hand, but also it's significant that it was Karl Marx and everything that he symbolises and signifies. It was his grave that was attacked.
Mm. So I think it was yesterday. It was Tuesday this week that Highgate Cemetery's Twitter account, they posted a picture of the grave, the vandalised grave. And they said this on their Twitter account. Karl Marx's memorial has been vandalised. It looks like someone has had a go at it with a hammer. It's a Grade 1 listed monument. This is no way to treat our heritage. We will repair as far as possible. And one of the things that's quite sad about this is that it might be irreparable, this damage. The damage to the marble. Friends of Highgate Cemetery Trust charity, I think they kind of own the grave or something. They condemned the vandalism as a deliberate attack on the memory of Karl Marx. The Trust Chief Executive, Ian Dungaval, do you reckon I've said that right? Probably not.
Yeah, maybe.
He said the grave will never be the same and it will bear those scars for the future. It's already scarred with traces of paint from previous damage. I'm really cross about this because it's a particularly inarticulate form of protest and it's not going to win any fans. Over the years, all sorts of things have happened to the grave. There was even a bomb left close to the memorial. But to be honest, this looks like it could be far harder to repair because of the damage to the marble. And the leader of your party, Steve,
yes.
Rob Griffiths, General Secretary of the Communist Party of Britain, he said the ideas of Marx, like his plinth at Highgate, are powerful enough to outlast any damage done by a fascist vandal. This moronic attack should help ensure an even bigger turnout for the annual Marx oration and ceremony there on Sunday, March 17th. The Labour movement and the left in Britain and internationally must now ensure that the monument is fully restored as quickly as possible. And I think I saw a lot of people trying to raise funds to repair it, to give to Highgate Cemetery so they can repair it. It's just pretty disgusting. It's pretty sad state of affairs.
Yeah, I think it is, but I think it's also, it's also something that that shows that the ideas of Karl Marx are something that are still strike fear into his opponents. And I think that what they did say was that it was obvious that this was a kind of a deliberate attack on Marx. They tried to erase his name, and with this suspected hammer attack, and they might erase his name from the grave, but they're never going to be able to get rid of they're never going to get rid of his ideas and erase his ideas. They still resonate with millions of people across the world. We've seen this with I spoke earlier about the resurgence of people like Bolsonaro and Donald Trump, but there is also a resurgence amongst the left as well. I mean, it's not you look at everywhere that a right wing movement is. There's always a left wing movement opposing it. We saw 1 million people out on the streets at a huge rally in India just this week. So the ideas of Karl Marx are still very relevant to today. They kind of explain today's society quite well and how the capitalist system works. But more than that, they don't just analyse capitalism. They sort of point to how to change it and change the system. And we've seen again how Marx's ideas have been applied and taken forward and built upon by people like Lenin, who led the Russian Revolution. Obviously, it's an attempt to try and attack the ideas of the left, and it's one that should rightly be opposed. Rob Griffiths is absolutely right, I think, in what he said. And the Marx Memorial Lecture oration will take place on the 17th of March. It'd be great to see as many people that can go to it as we can.
What is the Marx oration?
It's an annual event, and it's usually there's usually it's an oration, so it would be a speaker from somewhere across across the movement, so internationally as well. So I don't know who's giving the oration this year. I'm gonna have a little look now, but there's been all sorts of people that we've had people like the Cuban ambassador, for example, Teresita Vicente has given she gave last year's Marx oration. That was on the 200th, of course, the 200th anniversary of Marx's birth. There were big celebrations, big events across the across the world, I think, that celebrated that. So it's normally somebody with obviously who it's a celebration really of Marx's life. So I mean, obviously, in light of what's happened, it takes on a new significance. I think this year, and like you said, people have been rallying around trying to raise money, to repair the damage that has been done. But the ideas are still relevant. I think that's the main thing to perhaps take from this is that and of course the fact that somebody still now in 2019 thinks thinks that Marx's grave should be attacked and is frightened of Marx is kind of dismisses all of those people that think Marx, usually from the right, that say Marx is an irrelevance. Well, clearly Marx isn't an irrelevance. Clearly Marx is still relevant today and still somebody that is very much feared by those on the right.
Yeah, and like it in the grand scheme of things, damage to a grade one listed grave is not that bad. There's climate change and people dying. There's all sorts of horrible shit going on in the world, and after all possessions are fleeting. But still, it's still a shit thing. But I don't think it's a surprise at all. Like you said earlier, that that the far right is rising. The mainstream media consistently glorifies the far right. They consistently glorify far right narratives and policies, and they deliberately cast the left as something nonsensical or dangerous. I think one of the core reasons why the mainstream media does this is because they are corporations, and therefore they have a vested interest in opposing the left or any kind of democracy whatsoever. My absolute hero, I'm not sure if he's your absolute hero, but Noam Chomsky.
Definitely not mine. Most definitely not my hero.
One of my heroes, Noam Chomsky, he has a brilliant quote about corporations, and he says that a corporation, factory or business is the economic equivalent of fascism. Decisions and control are strictly top-down. People are not compelled to purchase the projects or rent themselves to survive, but those are the only choices. So the media, I think the media has made, as I think you probably agree with me, the media has made people believe that there is no alternative, that there is no such thing as society. And you've probably heard people say things like, socialism is a good idea, but it ends up with people eating their dogs. And at the same time, the centrists have offered up absolutely no solutions whatsoever to capitalism, and in fact have exacerbated it. They fucked up so hard that the only opposition to them, it seems to most people, to be the far right. This has given rise to Trump, Bolsonaro, and right-wing governments of Poland, Italy, Hungary, etc. Did you see the State of the Union last night, Steve? Trump's State of the Union to the
do you know what? It was on what time? About 2:00 in the morning, I think. As riveting as I find Donald Trump, I was actually awake, but I couldn't bring myself to watch the State of the Union address. No,
neither could I. But I saw some weird clips about it last night, and one that he said was that here in the United States, we are alarmed by the new calls to adopt socialism in our country. America was founded on liberty and independence, not government coercion, domination and control. Obviously, forgot to mention slavery, genocide, racism, entrenched class system, and economic inequality.
All those things, yeah.
He said, "We are born free and will stay free. Tonight we renew our resolve that America will never be a socialist country." Hooray! So rulers like this, people like Bolsonaro, Trump, and whatever the names of the people in the governments of Hungary and Poland, you know their names, surely.
Yeah. Well,
I mean, they're giving rise to this idea, and they give credence to this conspiracy theory called cultural Marxism, which is total fucking bollocks. It's about as concrete as aliens building the pyramids, or the fact that the Queen's a 6-foot lizard. It's got that much fucking.
I mean, I think we should actually point out though that whilst these people like Bolsonaro and Trump have taken power in Brazil or come to power in Brazil and the US, it doesn't necessarily mean this shift to the right. In the US, for example, Donald Trump lost the popular vote quite heavily to Hillary Clinton, and whilst Hillary Clinton isn't in any way, in many ways, she was worse than Donald Trump, Hillary Clinton. But and in Brazil, of course, the rise of Bolsonaro was to do with an administrative coup that goes back a few years, with the removal of Dilma Rousseff and the imposition of the Temer administration. And of course, they had to jail Lula. The popular former president, who would have won, every poll says, was leading in the polls for the presidential race until he was banned from standing in that election by the court. So Bolsonaro had to start kind of cheat his way to victory. So by this sort of lawfare, they called it, against Lula.
It's the same in the US. Trump lost the popular vote, but it's the electoral college that kind of got him in power, right?
Exactly. So everywhere that there has been this kind of, that people are talking about this resurgence of the right, there also has been, they've not had it all their own way, and they've been very closely fought. And of course, we've seen the rise of Jeremy Corbyn in Britain and the movement around him, and with momentum. And in France, Jean-Luc Mélenchon, for example.
Nice bit of French.
Très bien. So I think we need to be careful about how we kind of portray this.
That's a good point. I hadn't thought about that properly enough, actually, when I was preparing my notes this morning.
But it's obviously it's a worry, and obviously there's still this kind of anti-communism. I mean, you look at what's happening in Ukraine, where communist symbols have been banned, and the party's general secretary has been blocked from standing in the presidential election there. So of course there is this kind of anti-communist often made, like in Ukraine, for example, where it's been brought into law that you're not allowed to display communist symbols and insignia. So there is that, there's that kind of pervading anti-communism that exists, and that kind of feeds into this kind of thing like the rhetoric of people like Donald Trump, and then and those kind of that rhetoric and the stuff that's played out through the media, of course. Has consequences, as we've seen with the attack on the Marx statue in Highgate Cemetery.
Yeah, good rounding up there. Shall we move on?
Shall we?
Yes. So the next story we're going to talk about is Leyla Guven being given an honorary citizenship of Paris.
Yes.
Leyla Guven is not. I don't think many people know who they are unless they read our glorious newspaper or they're from Turkey.
No, but. Perhaps not, and perhaps they should do. Really,
they should do. Yeah, that's what I was gonna. That's what I was trying to lead to. Yeah, they definitely should know who she is. Steve, tell us about Leyla Guven. Who is she?
Leyla Guven is a Kurdish member of parliament in Turkey. She is elected to Hakkari. She's the MP for that from that area, and she. She's a very well known figure inside the country. So she's a member of parliament for the People's Democratic Party, which is the HDP. It's a pro-Kurdish party which achieved electoral success and much to the ire of Turkey's authoritarian president Recep Tayyip Erdogan. He's moved against all forms of opposition, as most people will know inside Turkey. But his particular target have been the HDP, or one of his politically, where in November 2016, following the lifting of immunity from prosecution for MPs, in a series of nighttime raids, the party's parliamentarians were arrested. And many of them are still in prison now. Leyla Guven herself was mayor of Viranşehir in Şanlıurfa province.
Whereabouts is that?
It's in southeast Anatolia. So it's I've been there. I've been there myself, and it's an interesting part of Turkey. It's where I went to Akçakale, which is on the border with Syria, which is where. In that particular province, which is where ISIS fighters have been crossing into Syria from Turkey. Anyway, she was a mayor for that area, and she was elected as an MP as well. But she was jailed originally. She was jailed in January last year, and she was jailed for statements that she made opposing Turkey's war. And illegal occupation and invasion of Afrin in northern Syria, known as Operation Olive Branch. Now, hundreds of people, more than 800 people, I think, were arrested for making comments or social media posts opposing that war. And Leyla Guven was jailed, and the charges against her, and the charges are still spreading terrorist propaganda, largely for the Kurdistan Workers' Party. That's the allegation. She faces
Kurdistan Workers' Party. Is that the PKK?
PKK, yes. And the background to this is the PKK are a banned organisation. In Turkey, they're deemed a terrorist organisation. They were founded in 1978, led by Abdullah Öcalan, who is still deemed the leader of the organisation. He's been in jail on Imrali Island in Istanbul since, I think, 1999.
He's in solitary confinement, right?
He's in solitary confinement, and up until recently had no visitors. So that's really the crux of what we're getting to with Leyla Guven's hunger strike. So on November the 8th last year, Leyla Guven was due to appear in court. However, she refused to attend, and she announced that she was going to be starting a hunger strike, an indefinite hunger strike, and she called it a death fast, which means that she's prepared to die unless her demands are met.
What does she want? What are her demands?
Her demands really are very simple. That she's demanded an end to the isolation of Abdullah Öcalan. She said, and they say that this is in breach of international legislation. He's not met with his lawyers since 2011, and up until this point, he hadn't been seen or heard from since 2016. So there'd been many times people had, and particularly Kurdish activists, had feared that he was dead. Because they hadn't heard anything about his well-being. So she started this hunger strike, and her demand is very simple: an end to the isolation of Abdullah Öcalan and all political prisoners in Turkey. Now, the interesting thing is this hunger strike has been going on. I think it's 92 days as we're recording this, and she was released from prison. Unexpected move.
Earlier last month, right, in January.
At the end of January, she was unexpectedly released from prison, and this is a bid to end the hunger strike, because the hunger strike has received a huge outpouring of global support and solidarity. 291 prisoners, political prisoners in Turkey, have joined the hunger strike. So it's having a really big impact. So largely that opposition has been led. Sinn Féin have been kind of leading the charge on this. They have been, and the obvious parallels are between the hunger strikers there and they've made reference to the Long Kesh hunger strikes of 1981, where of course most famously Bobby Sands was elected an MP during that campaign. However, sadly, on May the 5th of that year, Bobby Sands died. So they have a kind of there's that history, I think, that links the two. So they have that shared notion of struggle, because a lot of the struggle between the Irish hunger strikers and the Kurdish hunger strikers are making many of the same demands, and of course both the Irish and the Kurdish people have been struggling and fighting for their identity, for language rights, for cultural rights, for political rights, and their identity. So Sinn Féin have largely have been right at the front of that. Martina Anderson, was one of their MEPs, was part of a delegation that tried to see Leyla Guven in Diyarbakir, which is where she's being held in prison, or was being held in prison, sorry. And they were blocked by the Turkish security services. They were blocked from seeing her in prison. So this huge kind of outpouring of international solidarity led to a motion being presented in the Paris City Council earlier this week by Danielle Simonet, who is from the Left Party. And
is that France l'Insoumise?
La France Insoumise. She's the national spokeswoman for them too. But she presented this motion at the Paris City Council that called for that granted Leyla Guven citizenship of Paris, but also called for the French government to pressure Turkey to end the isolation of Abdullah Öcalan, and also to step in to prevent a massacre of Kurds in Syria, as Turkey's army and Turkish armed forces are preparing. And they've said now that Erdogan has recently said it's going to happen in a couple of weeks. Now he's threatening this ground invasion of Manbij. So this is a significant event. I think a significant decision by the showing that Leyla Guven does have kind of international support and solidarity. She's remaining absolutely defiant despite her release from prison. They've said that this is a ploy by the Turkish state to break the hunger strike, but it hasn't. I mean, it's also worth noting that we have and there's in today's Morning Star, there is a
Wednesday, February the 6th.
Thank you, Ben. There is we've carried an interview with Imam Shish, who is on hunger strike in Newport in Wales, and he's now, as of today, he'll be on his 52nd day of hunger strike. There was a huge rally in Cardiff yesterday in support of him, and also he's on hunger strike for the same demands. And this is not just people inside Turkey. There are hunger strikers in Strasbourg as well. People are at the European Parliament as well on hunger strike. So, this is outside of Turkey. They're doing this in solidarity. So he had support. So, for example, Liam Wood, the former leader of Plaid Cymru, spoke at the rally yesterday, and he's also said a similar thing, that he's prepared to take this all the way, and
all the way to
death. All the way means people are prepared to die for the cause and for their demands for Kurdish freedom. He's spoken about the support that he's had from the movement. Whilst this is also about the ending the isolation of Abdullah Öcalan, it's also for the basic rights and for Kurdish people to be treated as equals. And at the moment, then as Imam Shish said, that they're not even being treated as human beings at the moment. They're being denied all of their basic human rights. They're being denied their identity. So this is a big issue, but it represents a threat for Turkey. Erdogan is clearly worried about this. The Turkish state allowed Mehmet Öcalan, which is Abdullah Öcalan's brother, they allowed him to visit Öcalan. It was a very short notice thing. I think it was a very short visit, and it doesn't in any way address the demands, but it was clearly designed to try and break this popular support that is building for the Kurdish hunger strikers. And he's obviously worried because this it's spreading and it's gaining a lot of international support and solidarity. So he'll be feeling that pressure. I mean, don't forget Turkey have local elections coming up next month, and Erdogan has already deemed that he's decided that the HDP, Leyla Guven's party, are terrorists. They're
not allowed to stand.
They're an extension of the PKK. They're allowed to stand, but they won't be. He's threatened not to recognise any of their successes, and he'll just. I think it's a step towards. He's moving closer towards banning them as a party. I think that's where this is. That's the direction of travel. Wouldn't be the first time that a pro-Kurdish political party has been closed down by the Turkish state. Most of the HDP is the latest in a long line of those. But they have banned, I think, 13 or 14 political parties from standing in next month's election, including the Labour Party of Turkey, MEP, whose General Secretary Selma Gürkan also faces trial for comments that she made opposing the war in Afrin. So,
I think this situation totally highlights, the hypocrisy of the Western foreign policy, and of the media. Imagine if these people were Venezuelans trying to get Guaido. If they were supportive of this self-appointed president or interim president of Venezuela, the media would be all over this struggle.
Yeah,
but because Erdogan's a NATO ally, no one gives a shit.
Well, they don't. It's very clear, and this is a very clear argument again. When people like Jeremy Hunt and the British government and are trying to say that what's happening in Venezuela is an issue of democracy. Well, on the flip side of that is they couldn't care less about democracy. We know that, and Turkey is a classic example of that. You've had MPs from a legally constituted political party in prison, with about 8,000 of their activists in prison, and 85 of their elected mayors have been swept aside and replaced. So that's an issue of democracy, and that I've personally witnessed the elections there being held under the barrel of a gun, with election stations being closed down, ballot boxes being stuffed. Or ballots being stamped, en masse in favour of Erdogan. I mean, there's all sorts. I could talk about all sorts of this corruption that has been in Turkish elections, including the constitutional election, where 2.5 million ballot papers were unstamped ballot papers were suddenly allowed by the halfway through counting as well, this which tipped the balance in Erdogan's favour. I mean, they don't want to see the development of democratic forces inside Turkey. They don't want to see a free and democratic Turkey. Turkey is strategically, Turkey lies It has borders with Syria. It has borders with Iran. It has borders with Iraq. All of those are areas where the imperialist powers want to see regime change, and they're doing their best. They're not doing very well, but they're really trying to dislodge leaders there, obviously, and take control of those countries, which also, by complete chance, I'm sure, have huge oil supply.
Yeah, that's always the interesting thing, isn't it? I think two things that everyone should always keep in their mind. Well, one thing about Turkey, it has the most journalists in jail than any other country in the world. Mm-hmm. Venezuela has the most proven oil reserves in the world.
Yeah, and I think that's when they talk about democracy, we can ask them about why are you silent when Turkey is crushing all forms of opposition. Things are so desperate there that an elected MP, a parliamentarian, somebody who should be in Turkey's Grand Assembly, is actually starving herself to death because of the lack of democracy in that country. An elected MP. I mean, this is how bad. This says a lot about the state of things in Turkey and the state of democracy. So, if the British government really cared about democracy, they wouldn't roll out the red carpet to Erdogan. They wouldn't be selling him weapons and essentially propping up his regime. So, Leyla Guven's hunger strike is a hunger strike for freedom for the Kurdish people, but also it's one that has been entirely justified, and is the British government have a role to play in this, because they've completely by propping up Erdogan, they've allowed this situation to develop where 150,000 public sector workers are in prison, thousands of academics are in jail, and there's been a huge purge of opposition voices, and the media has been totally shut down across the country. So if they really believed in democracy, then they would they wouldn't support regimes like Erdogan. They wouldn't be supporting calling them like our friends, or whatever the terminology they've used to describe Saudi Arabia. Now, they complain about elections in Venezuela. At least they have elections.
Exactly.
I mean, this is
don't have elections in an absolute monarchy.
This is astonishing. So we should also keep that in mind, that particularly the Tories, when they've been in government, have supported every single corrupt and authoritarian dictatorship in history. So why would we believe them when they say that they're talking about democracy? They've backed coups, including the Chilean. Of course, Thatcher was famously friends with Augusto Pinochet, who was a brutal dictator who came to power in a CIA-backed coup in Chile in 1973, and that led to tens of thousands of people being killed or disappeared in the country. So they don't support democracy. Let's kill that right now. Let's not fall into that kind of thing. So if they're talking about democracy, we know what kind of democracy they're talking about.
That sounds like a good time to wrap this up. So let's move on to the interview we have. Through the power of editing, we're going to insert finally Marcel Cartier, the interview that Steve and your work experience assistant Gulistan did. What's her full name?
Gulistan Elidemir.
Yeah, she was in the episode last week, and you two interviewed Marcel Cartier about his new book. Why don't you tell us about it? Let's introduce it, and then we'll play it.
Oh, Marcel Cartier. Yeah, sorry. Sorry, Ben.
Welcome back.
What listeners won't know is that Ben did a battery change on the recording device, so I kind of zoned out a little bit. So I do apologise. For that. I do apologise to my good friend and comrade Marcel Cartier, because obviously it wasn't anything to do with him. But anyway, so Marcel visited the area in northern Syria known as Rojava 2 years ago, and he wrote a book about his experiences, which is coming out this month. It's this month, isn't it?
February 22nd.
February the 22nd, called Serkeftin. and he documents really about, he talks about his experiences, how his views on the Kurdish liberation movement, the Kurdish struggle, changed and developed during his time there, and is a very I'll leave you to decide about that. I mean, it's a very well written book, and I liked it, and I think it gives quite a different perspective from the literature that's already out there on Rojava. It's a good introductory point, and I think Gulistan said she reviewed it for the Morning Star, and she said that she didn't know very much about it. As a young Kurdish woman, it's kind of her history and her struggle as well. And she said that Marcel Cartier takes you on a journey, and she was happy to go on that journey with him and to kind of learn about the struggle for this kind of women's-led revolution, which is what the heart of the Rojava project. So her review is going to be in the Morning Star. So please look out for that as well. But I could talk about this for ages, but I think really it's best to leave it to the person who wrote the book himself, Marcel Cartier.
How are you? I'm good. How are you?
Yeah, wonderful.
It's been a long time. Is it Gulistan with you?
Gulistan is here, yes.
Hello, Marcel.
Gulistan, if you want to start off, do you want to ask the opening question?
Marcel, we wanted to find a bit about your background. Can you tell us a bit about yourself?
Sure. Well, I was actually born in Germany. My father's from the United States. My mother's from Finland. I have a background basically being raised around the U.S. military. So for the first 23 years of my life, basically all I knew was military bases and military installations. So a lot of people are quite surprised when they hear that, because obviously they see that I have a quite radical political orientation. I'm somebody who identifies as a revolutionary and as a communist. But it was in my teenage years really that I began to question this narrative about the superiority of the United States in the world, and the U.S. being this great champion of freedom and democracy, and all the other things that I was accustomed to hearing when I was growing up. So I went through a very profound period of, I would say, rupture from sort of the ideological tenets which had been imposed upon me, and through this period I ended up becoming a revolutionary activist, and in later years then ended up moving to New York in my early 20s, and also being active as not just an activist, but as a hip-hop artist in the hip-hop scene, and somebody who always wanted to sort of combine the musical and cultural aspect with the political aspect, and always took very seriously the role of hip-hop and the role of culture in building a revolutionary culture and a means basically to advance the struggle. So currently living in Berlin. I'm a journalist. I work for Redfish Media. Also active still in hip hop, working on my 10th album. In a sense, basically trying to utilize all means that I have to further revolutionary and radical politics.
So that's, that's quite. An interesting, so it's a very interesting background, and just from kind of challenging the U.S. role in the world, U.S. imperialism and its notions of freedom and democracy. But it's another step. Because your latest book is a narrative of the Rojava Revolution. But what inspired you to go to Rojava? Because obviously you visited there.
Right.
So what led to that? How did that come about?
Well, for years I was active in the anti-war movement in the United States, principally in New York, also in Washington for a period. And of course, like we've seen an era after 2001 where the U.S. has been involved in endless war in Afghanistan and in Iraq. The full decimation of Iraq, the murder of perhaps up to 1 million people or even more. We may never know the actual human toll. And then, of course, the U.S. also being responsible for unleashing sectarian sectarian violence and unleashing forces that would end up becoming forces like Daesh, for example, or support for Al-Qaeda-linked groups across Iraq and in Syria. But I would say just on Syria, because when the so-called civil war began in 2011, 2012, I was looking at it principally from an anti-imperialist perspective and from the perspective of somebody being in the United States, understanding that, well, the U.S. has intervened, especially most recently at that time in Libya, and looked as if it was spreading its tentacles across the region and was looking for regime change also in Syria. So I principally looked at Syria just in terms of this very sort of black and white notion of, well, you have imperialism on the one hand, basically orchestrated or spearheaded by the United States, looking to overturn or overthrow a sovereign government, and then you have, the Syrian government and independent government on the other side. But I didn't quite understand at this point all of the other contradictions within the Syrian framework or within the Syrian, example, and the main one, of course, being the national question and being the role of the Kurdish forces both in Syria and Kurdish forces across the region. So as a journalist, I actually traveled to Iraqi Kurdistan, to Erbil, for the first time in 2013. But I still lacked any kind of genuine understanding of the dynamics across the wider region. In other words, like we hear so often a very simplistic narrative about the Kurds, so-called, right? Like as if there's just a homogenous grouping, an ethnic grouping, and that they all have the same political perspective as well. So when I went to Iraqi Kurdistan, I have to say that I was not particularly, I guess you could say, impressed, because I simply saw like this Barzani sort of feudal, rapid capitalist development, which was taking place, like linked to the U.S. and them wanting to become essentially the new Dubai, things of this sort. But I didn't understand that there was this profound social revolution which was taking place right across the border in Rojava. So I think for me, it was really the bombing of, the siege of Kobani in late 2014 and early 2015. Like that changed everything, because the whole world was looking at Kobani and was looking at the fierce resistance of the YPG and the YPJ against Daesh, and that really became like the prime example for resistance against fascism in our generation. The new Stalingrad, some have called it, and I think on some level at least that comparison is apt. Definitely the beyond just an anti-fascist resistance, also one which was profoundly radical about grassroots democracy and principles of women's liberation and ecology, basically socialist principles that I've always identified with. So and also around this period I encountered Kurdish activists in London, one of them being Mehmet Aksoy, who Mehmet, of course, passed away in Rojava because he joined the YPG press office. He passed away in Raqqa in 2017. Mehmet was really a very influential person, somebody who, ended up having a profound impact on me, because I saw him speak one time, and I remember him talking about how, he had been reading the works of Black Panther leaders growing up, and this was somebody who I definitely identified with, and I could sense his revolutionary spirit and his enthusiasm. So, because of the example of Kobani, the example of women's liberation, and also because, being from the United States, I didn't know much about this movement, and I think it's because, on the one hand, in the U.S., we don't have the same, frankly, we don't have the large Kurdish community, right, the exile community or expatriate community that exists, for example, in places like where I am now in Germany. So I think that even among radical circles, there's always been less attention or understanding of the Kurdish revolutionary movement in the United States. So, this was a period where I had moved from the U.S. to Europe and was in touch again with frontline Kurdish activists. And at this point I said, so many of my close comrades, they don't even understand much about this particular struggle, or they have a false narrative, or what I was, seeing to be a false narrative about this struggle, that somehow it's, it's overblown or it's linked to imperialism,
one of the things
because of this, basically, exactly. Because of this, then I was like, you know what, like nothing actually takes the place of observation and participation, right?
Yeah.
At the end of the day, you can read about it, you can hear 100 things, but if you actually go to the source and you try to engage with it, that's the best way to learn about an actual process. And when I went, then I would say, and this I think comes across quite clearly in the book, it changed my life profoundly, and there were no questions left for me in terms of what is this movement and which direction is it heading in.
You just sort of touched on it, and this is one of the things that I really wanted to ask was around the YPG and the YPJ, the People's Protection Units,
right.
And the Women's Protection Units in that have been leading the fight against ISIS. Now, one of the things that is often bandied about, particularly on the left here, is in Western countries, is this criticism saying that they're the tools of US imperialism. Now, you speak about this in your book, and you talk about armchair revolutionaries looking for revolutionary purity. I mean, do you want to expand on that a little bit, because it's something that keeps coming up again and again?
Sure.
Particularly, like I said, particularly among the left.
Right, definitely. And I mean, it's a perspective that I can very much understand and relate to, because on some level it's a perspective that I actually held myself, probably in the first 3, 4, maybe even 5 years of the Syrian crisis, or the Syrian, really a proxy war, right? And of course the United States we know that they have interests in the so-called Middle East, and that they're opposed to the nationalist Syrian state as they were opposed to the, nationalist Iraqi state, the Arab nationalism of Saddam Hussein. They're opposed to the Arab nationalism of Bashar al-Assad, because it means that these countries and these state structures are outside of the penetration of U.S. capital, at least to the extent that they would like it to be. But I think when it comes to the Kurdish movement, one of the things that I tried to do with the book is to explain, first of all, that, of course, there's different tendencies within the Kurdish movement. You have a reactionary tendency or multiple reactionary tendencies, even within Syria, right? With the supporters of, for example, Barzani, the Kurdistan Democratic Party, grouped around the ENKS. And then, of course, you have the PYD, the Democratic Union Party, which is tied to or part of the umbrella group, the KCK, the Union of Kurdistan Communities, which the primary force in that grouping is the Kurdistan Workers' Party, or the PKK, which has been active in an insurgency against the Turkish state since the 1980s, and an organization that has always been not only condemned by the United States, but the United States has been actively facilitating the bombing and the destruction, and they have designated the PKK as a terrorist organization. And just recently, and in the past few months, there were huge bounties placed on the leaders, on the heads of 3 leaders of the PKK. The United States is still supplying fighter jets and logistics, and pointing out PKK targets on a daily basis to the Turkish state and to Erdogan. So
it's a complicated relationship with US imperialism and the Turkish state, because obviously we've seen this withdrawal or supposed withdrawal, and the forthcoming ground invasion of Manbij that Erdogan keeps threatening.
Right, exactly. I mean, the way that I think is very clear to express this this contradiction, right, is the fact that it was the United States under Bill Clinton that spearheaded the capture of PKK leader Abdullah Öcalan in 1999, right? And he is the figure for the Kurdish people in terms of if there's going to be any type of sustainable peace in Turkey long term, if there is going to be a viable peace process that can come to fruition. But again, with the YPG and the YPJ, because there is this relationship, of course, Erdogan and the Turkish state, they refer to Rojava as this corridor of terror. But the United States has always been playing a sort of double game. The United States some foothold in Syria, and in the YPG, the YPG, YPJ, they don't have any illusions about this have had any illusions. They've never said, "Oh, the United States are friends." There's never been any type of political. There's been some military support from the United States, but there's never been political support for the PYD or for the Rojava project. Because if there was that type of political support, then this would be setting a very unusual precedent for the United States, for an imperialist capitalist power to say, "Oh, well, we support what is essentially a radical grassroots revolution, with elements of socialism in it." That would be very, very bizarre. So the U.S. has never been a friend of the Kurdish people, the revolutionary Kurdish struggle, and there's no surprise by that on behalf of the PYD. And when I was there almost 2 years ago, there was always an understanding that this is a tactical, temporary military relationship, similar to what existed in the Second World War, to some extent between, for example, you had the Soviet Union fighting fascism on the same side as the Western capitalist powers at that time. And as soon as, obviously World War II ended, then we saw the acceleration and the development of the Cold War. So it has always been temporary. It's always been tactical. And, I think now things are becoming perhaps a little bit clear in terms of the fact that the YPG and YPJ have never been pawns of imperialism.
So you think it's really, the duty of the left to support the Kurdish, the Kurdish freedom movement, the Kurdish struggle?
Definitely, and to come to grips with it and attempt to understand and attempt to grapple with the contradictions and to continue to also push it in a progressive direction, because there's scope for all types of leftist elements. This is one thing that I recognized when I was in Rojava. You had, of course, those who support the model of American federalism, which is advocated by, Öcalan, the PKK, and the PYD. But then you also have, a multitude of communist groups from Turkey and from across the world, really, communists and internationalists who have come there either to fight or to build a civil institution. So I think that, yes, I think that it's the duty of the left to really try to understand this process, and to understand that it's an exciting process, and that, of course, like any other process, it's full of its contradictions, and it's not to say everything is rosy. It's not utopia, but at the same time, it's really providing, and it provided for me, I would say, a sense of regeneration, rejuvenation, in terms of having some hope that, in fact, there is a glimmer of sunshine in what is otherwise a very heinous reality across the world. But we do have, of course, the resurgence of the left, even in places like Britain. We see that with the Corbyn movement, the leftward push of Labour. But yeah, I that among all of these different movements which are developing and which are bringing some hope into our lives, finally, like almost 30 years after the collapse of so-called actually existing socialism, Rojava and the Kurdish movement is frontline in that.
There is this notion that the Kurds are tools of US imperialism, which to me is kind of, it's essentially it's a racist position to take, because it's denying the Kurds any kind of agency, but also making out that they're stupid, that they think as one. But there's a good tradition of, we talked about this Zio Kurds kind of label that's placed upon them, but there is a good strong tradition of the Kurdish movement working with allies in Palestine and the Palestinian freedom movement, and they've been getting tremendous support from Ireland as well, particularly there's some obvious parallels between.
Oh, for sure.
So I don't know if you could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, definitely. It's worth noting, I would say, off the bat, that the first martyrs of the PKK did not die fighting against the Turkish state. The first martyrs of the PKK fought actually fighting against Israel, which is very interesting because it's a history that I think is lost on a lot of people. The PKK had its camps in the Bekaa Valley in Lebanon, where they were training alongside their allies in the PLO from the communist Palestinian factions, like the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, PFLP, and the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine, the DFLP. So in 1982, during the Israeli bombardment of Lebanon, you had PKK fighters who valiantly fought side by side with their Palestinian comrades. And as recently as last year, when the massive protests were taking place in Gaza, you had the KCK, the Union of Kurdish Community, essentially, PKK guerrilla umbrella group, calling for solidarity with the Palestinians, saying we will never forget how we stood shoulder to shoulder in the trenches fighting against, Israel and Zionism. So there's often, and I hear this a lot really, because a lot of people just know about, again, Mahmoud Barzani. They know about the KRG, the Kurdish regional government in Iraq, and they know that there's, of course, been support from Benjamin Netanyahu for the feudal capitalist KRG, and they say, oh, that's the Kurds. And there's nothing, and I think also this narrative of the Kurds is also extremely racist, right? When you think about it, again, it's like lumping like an entire nation into one group and just essentially saying that they're stupid, they don't understand these dynamics, they're nothing but pawns. Again, like you said, that they have no sense of agency. The reality is completely different, and I hope that people would attempt to grapple and to come to terms with this, because like nobody would say like the Arabs for like an entire region comprising of tens of millions of people. It doesn't make any sense whatsoever.
Marcel, I was wondering if you could explain a bit about what makes the Rojava Revolution so important.
Yeah, well, I think there's, again, maybe I alluded to this a little bit, but there's, several pillars to this revolution, and I think the primary one is the participation of women, not only in the military structures, that is the YPJ, but also in building civil society. I mean, when I was there, again, it was nearly 2 years ago at this point, but one really impressed me was how there's a system of co-chairs which exists in the Kurdish freedom movement, where if there's a man appointed to a position, then a woman has to be elected to that position. There has to be proportional representation, and also just on a practical day-to-day level, organizations like the Malajin, the House of Women, in cities in Rojava, where they're dealing with issues like abuse, or dealing with issues like sort of reactionary feudal ideas like polygamy, or men being able to have more than one wife, for example. Like, they're tackling these sort of issues which perhaps are very tedious and will take a long time to actually overturn these kind of relationships, but they are definitely attempting to do so, and I saw them making headway with this. Also fascinating for me was the perspective on ecology and the understanding that a lot of times in previous social revolutions there hadn't been adequate scope given to the question of the environment. And now there's, for example, internationalists in Rojava who are working on a project centered, mostly around or solely around the ecological question, making Rojava green again, things like this. And I think also, for me, it was very profound to see, and it's confusing and disorienting a lot of times for people, because they say, oh, well, these are Kurdish separatists, right? And the reality is of course completely different. The reality is that the YPJ, and the ideology of this movement is not to carve out a nation state. The ideology of this movement is, in fact, to build multinational unity. Right, so when I was there, it wasn't as if Kurdishness was being imposed upon the non-Kurdish people of the region. But, for example, street signs were all written in not only Kurmanji, Kurdish dialect, but also written in Assyrian and written in Arabic. And there's there's an attempt to basically restore and to reinvigorate culture, not the Kurdish people of the region, but of all the peoples of the region, because it is a very diverse place where, it's not as if it's a homogenous region comprising just of the Kurdish people.
So you touched on one of the key points there. One of the common misconceptions, particularly from those that aren't familiar with the Kurdish freedom movement and the Kurdish freedom struggle, is this notion of separatism, and that the Kurds are trying to carve out a separatist state. That's not what they're trying to build. Certainly not in Syria. I don't know if you could explain a little bit more about that.
Yeah, sure. I mean, well, this was part of the paradigm change, as the Kurdish freedom movement calls it, where initially when the PKK was founded in 1978. The ideology was that Kurdistan is a colony, and that the Kurdish movement should fight essentially for national liberation, sort of a classical national liberation struggle. And to basically establish a independent socialist Kurdistan. And then, the ideology of the movement ended up changing in the mid-2000s, and Öcalan proposed instead that, the nation state won't bring freedom, it'll actually hinder freedom for the peoples of the region, especially like the non-Kurdish peoples of the region. So, what they've attempted to do, and we can see this in Turkey, and we can see it also in Rojava, and even in parts of northern Iraq, in so-called southern Kurdistan, where you have, for example, the Yazidi community, and in places like Shengal or Mount Sinjar, where there was the Daesh genocide of the Yazidi people in late 2014. But yeah, you can see how various communities have basically developed their own self-defense forces, and the idea is to create communities which basically organize autonomously, but communities which are not attempting to reconstitute like the state borders, for example. So there was actually opposition from some parts of the Kurdish freedom movement to the so-called independence referendum in South Kurdistan and Iraqi Kurdistan in 2017, because these activists were saying essentially that's not going to bring greater freedom. Just having like essentially a free Kurdistan is not necessarily a independent Kurdish nation state. But I think we're seeing sort of there's of course debate. Activists, again, like there's never a, like what I saw there is that there's never like a homogenous position on this. Like in any movement, you have differing opinions, and like how this is all going to play out, of course, remains to be seen. But I think that this notion that somehow the so-called Kurds of northern Syria want to fracture the region, and they want contribute to a Balkanization project, which is the wish of U.S. imperialism, is the furthest thing from the truth.
One of the things that you certainly talk about in your book, and one of the difficulties that is facing Rojava, is they've been trying to, the Kurdish movement has been trying to build this, democratic society, this new kind of society, but they've been doing it in the middle of a war where they've been under attack from jihadist, various jihadist organisations, ISIS, of course, and a war-ravaged country. And you sort of touch upon this notion of a war economy. Can you just talk about that a little bit? Because I think that it's quite interesting just to hear about the difficulties that are faced building a new society in very difficult conditions.
For sure. I mean, building, not just a new society, but actually the physical work of rebuilding areas and cities ravaged by the war. I mean, when I was in Kobani, for example, it had already been about 2 years since the liberation of the city, and I mean, parts of the city where the most intense fighting was when the Kurdish forces only had a small amount of territory left right on the Turkish border. I mean, those are being preserved as essentially a museum, so that people can, come pay tribute and see what actually took place. Whole rebuilding or was happening. I'm sure it's developed a lot more since I was there. But of course, it's also been hindered by the fact that, well, for one, there hasn't really been any substantial investment that I've seen or that I've heard of from international powers wanting to come in and responsibility for rebuilding. But also when you have very limited resources and you are in the middle of a war, then the majority of your resources are going to be dedicated to the cause of the war. It's a war economy, and it's essentially war communism in a sense, right? Like you have to put resources where they're most needed to actually fend off the enemy. And in this case, there are multiple enemies, of course. You have Daesh, but then you also have, for example, Turkey right there. right there across the border, and now they're talking about the creation of the so-called safe zone, which, of course, the safe zone is not going to be. It's not going to be safe for the the YPG. It looks like they're trying to create a safe zone for Turkey, which is an absurd concept because we, of course, know very well through historical example and recent example who the aggressors are. Especially, it's been just over a year now since Turkey this invasion of Syria and its subsequent occupation and ethnic cleansing of Afrin. But yeah, just in terms of the rebuilding efforts, they are happening gradually. But yeah, it'd be very interesting to see now, 2 years after I've been there, like how more developed they are. But one thing that I did find interesting, and I think is important also, is, I asked this question over and over again to it's essentially economic ministers. They have a different term which they use for them, which is escaping me right now. But people in charge of essentially how to develop the economy, and they said, well, we don't want this economy that exists in Bashur in Iraqi Kurdistan, where you have essentially capitalism on steroids. We don't want that. We're willing to some foreign investment, but we will always have a situation where if there is foreign investment, then it has to be for the betterment of the society, and it cannot oppose ecology, and it cannot be on a truly capitalist basis, and have the ownership, at least 51% ownership amongst the people of the land and amongst the so-called self-administration. So yeah, again, like I'm sure these examples have perhaps changed. I'm sure development has taken place, but what I saw was also a sense of hope that when the war does wind down, they'll be able to rebuild. They'll be able to build a society which was very, very different from what existed before.
Marcel, can you tell us a bit about how you see the future of Rojava?
Yeah, well, I think for the immediate future, of course, there's still this threat of the fascist incursion into Rojava, and it's a situation which actually is quite sickening. For example, when you think about the fact that Trump and Erdogan had this phone call, and then Trump goes on Twitter and he tweets that Turkey is going to be responsible for wiping out the last remaining pockets of Daesh. Clearly, he doesn't understand that Turkey has been facilitating the essential arming and recruitment of Daesh for the entirety of the war. So I think the immediate future is really one of resistance. I think as internationalists, I think as activists in the West, we have to do all that we can to support this struggle, because Turkey is talking about an invasion of Manbij. They're talking about this so-called safe zone. They definitely have their eyes set on Kobani, picking up where Daesh left off, essentially, Qamishlo, all of the cities in the north of Syria. So I think the immediate future is definitely one of struggle, it's one of resistance, and I think that it's unfortunate that the Kurdish forces are going to have to, invest again, like so much of their resources and time in just fighting off the fascist threat. Whereas they could be developing the Rojava project. But yeah, I think that history shows us that the will of the guerrillas, the will of the oppressed, the will of the those fighting for national liberation is always much stronger than those who are for example forced to join the Turkish military. It's like when the U.S. fought in Vietnam, and of course, the Vietnamese liberation forces won that war because they actually believed in what they were fighting for. The U.S. troops were just forced into that conflict, which a lot of them began to see was not a conflict which had any benefit for them. So I think we see something similar where those in the YPG, they really believe in what they fight for. They're fighting for liberation, not just for themselves, but for all of humankind at the end of the day. So I think that the Rojava Revolution will be victorious. There's a lot that's up in the air, of course, but this is how social revolutions always unfold.
That's perfect, Marcel, and I think that's a perfect way to round up the interview, just to say that the Rojava Revolution will be successful, and it's that notion of it's a fight for the liberty of all of humankind. Absolutely, perfect. Yeah, I think that's it. Is there anything else you desperately wanted to add?
I mean, just in terms, I guess, of the book itself. If I could just talk a little bit about that, because it's been, it's been a long time coming. The book is going to be out on February 22nd, worldwide via Zero Books. I hope that people will check it out, read it, and engage with it, whether you agree or disagree. But I hope that, and the reason that I wrote the book is just to provide a platform for many people, especially who maybe don't know much about this process.
Welcome back. So hope you enjoyed the interview. We're just going to wrap up the podcast now. I kind of need to go to work, so we should do this a bit quickly. We're going to have a listener question here. Of course, we don't have any listener questions, so we've decided to debate whether people should say tea time or dinner time. Where do you stand, Steve?
Tea time. Definitely 100% tea time.
Me too, tea time. I say tea time too.
I thought we'd agree on that, but we ought to mention what we mean by tea time or dinner time.
Well, tea time is usually the meal that you have in the evening.
Yeah,
particularly, it's a pretty working class thing to say, isn't it? I'm not sure if it's working class.
Yes,
but
it
I know up north, people always refer to the evening meal as tea time. What we having for tea, as people would say where I grew up in Derbyshire. Dinner time. Do you know what? I aspired to say tea time, but because I was an English teacher in Korea and Japan for quite a long time, I quite often say dinner time, and it annoys me because I should be saying tea time.
I never say dinner time. I have my dinner at dinner time, which is like around midday or just after midday. That's dinner. School dinners gives a kind of clue as to what time of day you have your dinner, and you have your tea at tea time.
Exactly.
Tea time's always been like any time kind of after 5 o'clock.
Yeah.
I think it is a class thing as well. I think that's partly behind it, but I'm definitely in the camp of tea time. Northerners always say tea time, don't they?
They do, yeah.
All Northerners say tea time, and I think working class Southerners also say
tea time.
Tea time, but I'd be interested to see what the consensus is on that.
Yeah, it might be confusing for anyone who's not British. This tea time thing, because we don't actually have tea. You don't have to have tea at tea time. You just eat your dinner. You eat your tea.
You eat your tea.
See, because I was an English teacher for so long, if I told my students tea time, it blew their mind.
I have had this from people from Turkey that I said when I mentioned, do you want some tea? Should we have some tea? And they thought they meant cup of tea, and have to get into that thing about explaining tea is like something that you eat, and I think it's really confusing because they get when they're learning English as well. Of course they learn the different times of day for meals, and I think they're told that dinner time is your evening meal.
My granddad always used to refer to lunchtime as snap. So what we have is snap. Snap. Yeah. And I think, I'm not entirely... It's a good phrase, isn't it? It's very common, especially in the older generation, people of my granddad's generation, in Derbyshire. They say snap quite often. And I'm not sure, but I think it's to do with, when you open your lunchbox.
Yeah.
It snaps open. So I think that's where it comes from. I could be talking straight from my arse, but I'm pretty sure that's where it comes from. I think there's loads of the further in the north, there's loads of different phrases for lunch. I really like snap. What we aim for snap, my granddad always used to say.
There's loads of different phrases for loads of things in the north of England.
It's a great place. Great place.
Yeah, I have family from the north of England. I've lived there myself. It's right.
All right, cool. So not much of a debate there. I think normally we have
we normally have some kind of disagreement.
Yeah. But let's see what the listeners.
Do you have dinner at dinner time then?
Yeah, but you might have snap at dinner time.
I've never had snap at dinner time.
Treat yourself to snap.
I might treat myself to snap. I think, could be.
So let's wrap this up. That was episode 5 of the Evening Moon podcast. Steve, if people want to follow you on the internet, how can they do that?
They can find me on Twitter at Sweeney Steve, which is SWEENEY, and Steve, STEVE.
Excellent. And if you want to follow me, I'm on Twitter and I'm at Cowlesy, which is COWLESZ, because I'm cool.
As fuck.